This is, in addition to being our first program of 2021, it's the first speaker series program that we've attempted to convene as a panel using the Zoom platform. So we're continuing to innovate in response to the challenges of the pandemic, and we so much appreciate all of you, panel members and JHS members and guests and friends of the Historical Society for joining us for this and helping make this a success. Thank you for being with us. This evening's program, as always, is underwritten by the generosity of Retina Associates and also with the support of the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville. My co-host for this evening's program is the Reverend Canon Allison DeFoor of the Episcopal Diocese. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Jacksonville Historical Society and better qualified than I am really to lead a discussion of churches and their issues. But he has graciously consented to stand with me as we lead this discussion or guide this discussion and host it. Also joining us for this evening's panel is Pastor James Clear of Mount Olive AME Church here in downtown Jacksonville. Pastor Clear, would you raise your hand so that people can recognize you? Great, thank you.
Good evening.
Also with us is Reverend Tiffany McCall of First United Methodist Church here in downtown. Reverend McCall, would you wave for the camera? Thank you very much. And also with us is Jenny Kokenauer of the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd, and she is graciously waving at the camera. And so those are the principal panel discussants for this evening's topic. And the title of the program is This Old Church. I happen to, in addition to my other responsibilities, I chair the Property and Maintenance Committee at the church of which I'm a member, Riverside Presbyterian Church. And ever since I took up that committee chairmanship, I've been promising everybody that after I retire someday, I'll write a book called This Old Church. And so that was the inspiration for the program title. But one of the inspirations for the idea for this discussion was the controversy that spread in Jacksonville last year when one of our historic downtown churches, First Baptist, undertook an application to demolish their historic Sunday school building. And the reasons for that were complicated, but it became somewhat controversial. And it also developed during that same year that another one of our downtown churches, an urban congregation on the South Bank, South Jacksonville Presbyterian, also rededicated part of its historic campus to redevelopment as residential apartments. Both of those incidents really speak to some of the challenges that historic churches face in the 21st century. And in Jacksonville, an increasing number of churches are approaching their centennial. Some of them are actually older than 100 years. Some of them are in their 80s or 90s. Reverend McCall's church is some 60 years old, I believe, at this point. All of them qualify for historic status, and all of them were built at a time when their lives and the lives of their congregations, their members, were very different from what they are in the 21st century. So all of us who care for and are stewards of these churches face similar problems: aging physical infrastructure, a congregation that has spread out across the county, across Jacksonville, in some cases throughout the region, and also the challenges of being relevant at a time when the church and worship and faith and denomination alliances all have continued to shift over the last several decades and certainly over the last century. Those are some of the things that were on our minds as we were thinking about this. And Reverend DeFoor, I'm going to ask if you might have some comments that speak to some of these challenges.
Just briefly, Churchill, of course, has the great quote that we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And that's certainly been true of churches for the last 1,000 years, certainly, and for the last 500 around the world, definitely. Churches are you go back even 100 years, and most of the shots of a city would show more spires than anything else as points of reference. And in Florida, where our building materials were scant, particularly at the beginning. And we've moved so quickly from the third to the third largest state in the union, from the smallest and poorest in the South, except for Arkansas at the time of my mother's lifetime, that the buildings that really are our heritage here, that were built right and built to last and have stayed through that period, are really the churches. And we've got a ton of them in the Episcopal Church, and how to keep them open, how to keep them functional, how to keep them useful is very, very challenging. And we've tried to be very creative in our approaches. We've moved them a lot. We've moved a lot of our churches around over the years, and some we've secularized and have become the San Marco Civic Community Center. The one went to the museum at the beaches, and so we've been somewhat creative. But I think you'll see more and more of the City Court building in New York is a tall example of the kind of collaborations I think you'll see on properties going forward. The proposals for St. Bart's on Park Avenue it didn't happen, but it was the kind of creativity that I think you'll see more of going into the future, where air rights will be utilized in order to keep the historic properties open and functioning. So, but it's very, very challenging because they are very, very expensive.
Our buildings were constructed at a time when almost everything, in many cases, certainly the systems and the methods of construction, were different from the way buildings are constructed today. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Church sanctuaries tend to be robust and sturdy, but that means as they age, they take a uniquely strong and high level of engagement just to keep them in good shape physically and keep up with our stewardship responsibilities. Some of our old churches were built without the air conditioning in mind, or without amplified sound systems. And all of those things are now expected and part of the day-to-day life of worship or gatherings anywhere. Most of our old churches were built without so much in the way in mind of a demand for parking, and yet many of our members travel by car from quite some distance to attend worship, and they expect to be able to park conveniently close to their destination. These are some of the challenges I think that are in common. Pastor Claire, I wonder if you would have some comments about the experience that you've had at Mount Olive AME and your congregation and its situation in the community.
Olive, at the building that we presently worship in, will be 100 years old in 2022. And of course, when that present sanctuary was built, approximately, I'm going to say 90 to 95% of the congregation lived within a 2-mile radius where the church presently sits. At this point, those numbers have been reversed. I would say less than 5% of our members live within a 2-mile radius. And as you just brought out, parking becomes a primary issue. Also, the fact that we are part of the eastern thrust of progress. So things are looking to change within our neighborhood. So it's not just preserving the church, but also trying to preserve some of the character and history of the entire neighborhood, as well as the church. So all of those things we would like to take into consideration as time progresses. And of course, the stewardship of the building, I think you and I had a brief conversation. Our 4 parents were able to do more with nickels, dimes, and quarters than we are able to do with our dollars.
It's the truth. The stewardship responsibility is endless, and the costs continue to become more significant and more substantial. When you mention what our forefathers and mothers did, the people who came before us in building and stewarding these congregations, it's sobering and also a joy to think about how many people came before us and who made the work of establishing these churches really part of their life's mission. And their passion and their devotion and generosity really represent the work of generations. And all of us who steward old churches now stand on their shoulders. Reverend McCall, would you care to offer some perspective from where your congregation stands today in the Cathedral District downtown in Jacksonville?
Well, first, let me say this. First Methodist was established in 1823. And so we are coming up on 200 years soon. However, the current sanctuary is about 53 years old. Our education building is about 100 years old. It was built in 1822, I believe. And then the building next to it, I think it was built around that same time. So there are 3 buildings right there, but the youngest is the current sanctuary, which is a beautiful edifice. All of the churches around, they just represent such a wonderful time in history for the church. You know, in the 40s and 50s, people were rushing to church and people were close by. But now people are living far out and in the suburbs and different areas, and they very rarely come in on Sunday mornings to the downtown area. So that is part of the issue that we're having. I think that it's important that we preserve these churches. I'd love to see First Methodist as one of the historical churches, now that we're at least 50 plus years old. I think this is important because it helps us, and I think it will help the generations to come to see the heart of the people that came before them and the importance of preserving Christian heritage. Is so much in these churches, you know, from the organs to the windows to the altars, just magnificent architecture. So we just have so much rich heritage there that I would like for us to hold on to and embrace, and for the city to see this, because it came on the backs of a lot of hard-working American people that truly believed in God and truly believed in stewardship. And so finding creative ways now to continue that kind of stewardship is difficult, particularly in a pandemic where everything is online, and with a generation that, you know, they don't have to go to a place. You know, they feel they can gather just about anywhere, and so that is very difficult to help them understand. So I think what you all are doing and bringing awareness to the churches and sharing them in the public eye reminds people that we're not only are we still here, we're still open, we're still worshiping, and we're still sharing the word and the love of God with our communities.
You made a reference to the importance of having people in the community and visitors see these historic churches, mm-hmm. and they bear witness by standing in the community, not just to the faith of people who are Methodists or Presbyterians or Catholics or Episcopalians or Jewish, mm-hmm. or any other denomination that you care to mention. They are also they are physical evidence of the authenticity of the place. They're evidence of the experience of the people, the generations of citizens of Jacksonville who came before us. Whether they belong to any of these churches in particular at all or not, the churches still stand as the authentic fabric of yes. Jacksonville, as it has served its people and has been lived in by its people and relevant to its people for the decades, now really for the centuries. The city of Jacksonville is approaching its bicentennial. The city will be 200 years old in 2022. And
We can celebrate together.
yeah, yeah, 100. Well, yeah, your church. I think you said your education building was built in 1822. I think you meant 1922, but when you get to
Oh,
100 years
yes, you're
old,
right.
but when you get to a century, who's counting anymore, right? Howard, I wonder if you can speak to the experience of your fellow congregation members at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd in the Riverside neighborhood.
Yes, yes. I am almost 20-year member of the Church of the Good Shepherd. We're at Stockton and Park, and we have been a church for 150 years, 2020. We had hoped to have a wonderful celebration all year long. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020. So we sort of tabled that, and that will go on. But in the meantime, I had been thinking about the church building itself as I came every week for years and sat there in the beautiful sanctuary. And I wondered, how did we get to where this building is today, the grandeur of it? And I come to it naturally because I've been an interior designer for 42 years. So I'm prone to think about the building and the materials. If you don't know about Good Shepherd, we're known as the first church of the swimming pool. The church that taught thousands to swim. And that is because in 1920, Mrs. Cummer gave the funds for the pool. We had a very, very forward-thinking rector, Reverend Worsham. And in 1916, he wanted very much to have the church established as the center of people's lives. He wanted a 7-day campus so that there was something going on all the time for everyone. So when the first building was built, it was in 1918, and they actually built the gymnasium first. So it had to be done building by building, and the actual sanctuary that we use today, the soaring Gothic revival, beautiful sanctuary, was built in 1929, the year of the Depression. So, you know, that was the kind of thing that it shows us today. There was hardship then and there's hardship now. It's just a different kind of hardship. And they were able to go on. The reason I wrote the book is so many of the people at Good Shepherd, I noticed my friends were aging out. They were either getting too ill to come to church or they were dying. And these are wonderful people who had been in the community for years, doctors, lawyers, judges, and wonderful members who loved the Lord and loved their community and their church. And I realized that there were already gaps in the history of the church. And I wanted to capture the history of that church so that it wouldn't go unrecorded. We were already getting, you know, some different kinds of verbal histories that were conflicting. And I realized that there were just tons of archives. There are files. There were, you know, almost anyone who died in Riverside, Avondale, or Ortega in the last 50 years, when their relatives came to clean out their homes, they found big boxes of things, and usually always there were 2 or 3 boxes of files and papers that they came and dumped at the church office. And the people at the office had their own work to do and didn't know what to do with them, so they just would put them in the attic, put them in the basement, put them in a spare room. And we just had thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. And so I spent a year of my life in 2013 going through all of these histories and working with a wonderful gal at the church who had saved so many things. And so that is the reason for the documentation. And the reason that I think we're relevant today in terms of the Historical Society is that The church, the materials themselves are beautiful and they're patinaed. We have stained glass from France and Italy and Belgium and Holland. We have exquisite wood carvings from Germany. The tiles on the floor were made by hand from wax impressions from the British Museum. We have the Skinner Opus 25 pipe organ, and there's only two left, I think, in America, and one is at the National Cathedral and the other's at St. John's the Divine in New York. So very proud of that organ, and it's currently undergoing some work itself. And as we all know, the biggest challenge to a big old Gothic building of age is the challenge of maintenance. And because of the materials that were used at Good Shepherd, we also will have the challenge of the people, the workers who can do that kind of work, who can repair that work. It can't be done by contractor on the street. You know, it's specialty work. And of course that adds to the cost too, because if we're going to do it, we want to do it right. I realized when Notre Dame caught fire 2 summers ago that if Good Shepherd caught fire or had to be built again, it would be like rebuilding Notre Dame. I think in Jacksonville and the place and the time that it is now, it would just be nearly impossible to replace that kind of church building.
Mhm.
And as we know, everybody, and when you go to Europe, you visit the churches, and the churches are still the center of almost every small town in Europe. And we were moved away from that, just like Alan said, with everyone driving a car and everyone moving out and that sort of thing. And so the churches have not become the center of our lives. And that adds to that challenge of maintaining that sort of building. And, you know, those of us who are passionate about old buildings and our churches, we don't want to see that go to the wayside.
Jenny, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned something that resonated with me, and that is that people cherish the consistency and the continuity of their historic places of worship. And that has become something that's particularly, I think, valuable and significant, kind of an anchor in a time when almost everything else around us seems to be changing at a rapid pace. And a lot of us, I think, take peace from knowing that there is one place where maybe it's not true to say nothing ever changes, but you can at least depend on a certain amount of incremental change and overall continuity and consistency. I was also struck by your conversation about family members of the congregation, their relatives, bringing by photos and letters and artifacts and that sort of thing, the memories of the lives that their beloveds had in a church. A church history is really community history when you think about it.
Yes.
Generations of people experience the lives of their families, their friends, their neighbors, their associates in business and work and the professions and trades. And a lot of those experiences and lives intersect back and forth across the lives of communities of faith. And the records that churches accumulate over time, we really need to think about them as not just being the records of that particular church and its members, but the lives of the larger community. And so at the Jacksonville Historical Society, we really advocate for the preservation of church archives. We encourage people to take those things seriously, to make sure that they are preserved and in safe conditions, preserved against deterioration or the risk of loss by hazard. And we encourage them to really be actively preserved, which means cataloged and inventoried and made accessible so that when people have a question that those archives can answer, that the answer can be located. It's a great treasure, and we at the Historical Society are available to be helpful and supportive to churches that face those challenges, and we would like to advocate that and encourage it. I should remind everybody who's in attendance on our Zoom meeting tonight that you can pose a question or a comment using the chat function. There's a button. If you move the cursor down to the very bottom of your screen on the Zoom window, you can see a link for a chat, and you can post a comment or a question there. And the Historical Society's Director of Marketing and Communications is on the call this evening, Kate Halleck. Thanks very much, Kate. Will you give a wave to everybody so that they know who you are? Very little happens around the Historical Society without Kate either having a hand on it or an advisory function, or really just doing it all. So I'm very grateful to her and grateful for what she's done to make this meeting work tonight. She'll be refereeing traffic with the chat and the questions. And I guess I would ask Kate if at this point there are any questions that you have seen that have come up so far that we should share among the panel members.
There are no questions at this time, but somebody has made a comment that insuring the beautiful buildings is no easy task. So if anybody wants to talk about some of the financial difficulties with these older buildings, that might be a nice topic.
I'll be happy to jump into that one. That's an unfortunately large part of my world. I was a unpaid prison priest for a long time and didn't have to worry about such matters as this. Life was a lot simpler once upon a time. But the church insurance is terribly complex and expensive, and in many ways it is it's hard to insure these kind of buildings because you're any sort of deductible at all, which is normal and routine in context of an insurance. When you start looking at Good Shepherd, for instance, by the time you start valuing all of that artwork and stained glass and everything else, your deductibles can go astronomical. Now, that being said, once you get to the deductible, the insurance is pretty good for getting the for getting something. But then you would face the challenge that the church faced in New Zealand, where one of the cathedra was knocked down there, and there was a question of where do you get the workers in today's world. I know it when I was in Tallahassee, we redid the chickee huts at the historical Mission San Luis, and where do you get people to do thatched huts that are 60 feet tall in today's world? Well, the Seminoles were our first guests, and they were too busy making money with Hard Rock cafes, so they actually had to go to all the way to South Africa to get people who even had the capabilities of doing it. And you'd face a similar situation. I suspect you'd have to go to Europe, would be my guess. But the ultimate challenge, I think, is, and of course, keep in mind with Cathedral that they weren't built like, we would want to rebuild like they're doing with Notre Dame virtually overnight. When can we be back in business? Well, Notre Dame took hundreds of years to build. Most of the cathedral in Europe took, some of them, 400 or 500 years to build to completion. So we have some expectations that are different. And even when we talk about cost, the longer term sweat equity, if you will, like a place like Federal Point, where we have some gorgeous Gothic churches up and down the river from steamboat days, and they sold alligator eggs to help raise money. And they toted when they ordered the parts, they were delivered FOB on the dock, and they had to physically pick it up because it was too expensive to get them to tote it all the way to where the church was going to be built, and they had to physically carry it apart. So relative costs are different, but I think the ultimate issue is how do we make these buildings speak to the current age? Because cathedral are one of my best examples. If you look at the medieval context of a cathedral, when you walked into it, it was an incredibly powerful teaching moment in the context. I mean, it was like MTV would have been when it first came out, or some of the things you can see now on the web. it just was overwhelming with its power, particularly to an illiterate audience. And we haven't allowed them to speak to us in this age. Now, there are examples going the other way. If you Google up Notre Dame de Montreal in Canada, they have done an incredible job of using LED lights to light up the teaching of the cathedral in a way that utilizes everything in it. Good Shepherd would be a fabulous venue for that. And the cathedral district did a little bit of that at Christmas with their exterior lighting. And the Catholics in particular at the Basilica did a wonderful job of using their exterior as a teaching moment. But if anybody gets a chance, and I would urge Good Shepherd in particular, the older churches have a real opportunity to retool back to the original purpose of using these edifices as not as, because really ultimately it's not about the building, it's about the people. And if the people aren't coming, it's probably because we're not getting the use out of the building that we could.
All right, we have another question for the panel. Would any of the panelists be able to share any anecdotes about a historic religious gathering, a special gathering such as when President Kennedy was assassinated or Martin Luther King, a story from 9/11, or have any US presidents ever worshiped in a Jacksonville church?
I can speak on the social note of that. We had a Vanderbilt wedding back in the 30s, maybe early 40s. And I believe the young lady was from Jacksonville, and she married Vanderbilt, and I believe FDR came. I'll have to research that, but we did have a very famous wedding with a lot of famous people coming down from the north for the service. So let me get back to whoever wants to know that and confirm it. I have pictures, but I don't remember all of the story. There are people who told me about this, who sent the pictures to me. So I know there are others in town that know about it, that remember.
All right, one of our participants asked if Bethel, and I'm assuming that's Bethel Baptist, did they have a funeral for Bessie Coleman there? Does anybody know that?
That's a great question, and I do not know the answer to that.
I can tell one story that's on another denomination, and everybody who knows me knows I'm a bit of a mischief maker. It's a mischievous story, but the Roman Catholic in St. Augustine, a neighboring community of ours, had a bishop die in the late 1800s, and apparently the new thing to do at that point in time that they were trying out in the undertaking world was to have a glass faced coffin, which people could then view the deceased. And apparently, because of the distances involved, it was resolved to take a bit of time to have the funeral. And unfortunately for the results, it was in the summertime. And you don't need to project too far in your mind to figure out that the explosion, when it occurred during the course of the funeral, was emptied the place pretty fast. So that's about my biggest story that I can tell on.
Okay, we do have an answer. Our wonderful senior archivist, Mitch Heeman, has confirmed that Bessie Coleman's funeral was indeed held at Bethel Baptist. We have another comment. Riverside Avenue Christian Church is celebrating its 100th year anniversary this year. And a gentleman asked, is there a way for all of the centennial churches to be included on a historical society tour virtually? to lift everybody up in the community. So we would definitely think about that. I think that's a wonderful suggestion. Looks like maybe Dr. Crooks might have a couple of comments. Let me put him on video. All right, Dr. Crooks, if you would begin speaking.
Hey, Jim, the floor is
Hi,
yours.
everybody. I wanted to look, I respect what everybody has said about the historic value and beauty of these old churches and the challenges of maintaining them. I would like to look at Jacksonville churches from a slightly different perspective. For example, and some of you know I've done research in Jacksonville history, but Bethel Baptist Institutional Church, as it was rebuilt in 1901 after the fire, became what was called an institutional church, which its purpose was to not only have worship in Sunday school, but have after-school programs, healthcare programs, to minister to the total congregation in ways that the community didn't minister in those times. And it's that theme that I would love to see developed in Jacksonville history of our churches. For again, another example, what is now Woodland Presbyterian Church was Laura Street Presbyterian Church in the early 1960s. And it was from there that the civil rights movement began. It sparked, Pearson,
Rutledge Pearson.
Rutledge Pearson's leadership with young people, that some of whom are still alive in our community, to demonstrate at the lunch counters and elsewhere throughout our community. It was the spark plug. First Baptist Church of Oakland was a spark plug for civil rights and building housing for the community in that neighborhood. The African American church has a long record of reaching out and doing things for its community. But white churches have also been involved. My wife's been involved in one group, I've been involved in another. On the south side, there's a group called UCOM, United Community Outreach Ministry, which began in the 1980s with a handful of churches concerned about the welfare of lower income residents of Pine Forest. It began with the Meals on Wheels, but development has been going on now for 30 years, providing not only Meals on Wheels, but after school programs, emergency needs. It's now a group of some 30 churches and synagogues of multiple denominations working together for the benefit of people in need on the south side. Downtown, about 25 years ago, I can't precisely date it, Downtown Ecumenical Services Council was formed out of the churches downtown, First Presbyterian, the Cathedral, the Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, and they came together to provide emergency services for residents of our community. It's, to me, as we talk about churches, we need to remember that our mission as servants of the Lord is to serve our fellow people, particularly those in need. And the examples of Desk and UCOM, to me, speak so much for what Jacksonville churches have done and could do now and looking into the future.
Let's not forget the project of the eye care project that is a joint effort of many congregations in Jacksonville that engage themselves each year with a particular issue of broad social justice. And it's one of the ways that the broader church communities can really have a role and be relevant in the broad community. All good points. And the relevance of churches, particular churches, especially in the climactic years of the civil rights movement, is a story really all unto itself, and one that almost every city in the United States can speak to. And Jacksonville's history there is an honorable and distinguished one. And I think that's a subject for a program that we really ought to convene and focus on that particular topic. And there are representatives of some of the influential churches that opened their doors to the people who really risked everything at the peak years of the civil rights movement.
There was a question was asked whether any religious services after 9/11 or after Martin Luther King's death. There was one in Jacksonville in 1963 after Martin Luther King's assassination. Hans Tansler, who was the mayor at that time, gathered, and I think it may have been the Episcopal Jenny's church. I'm not sure, I forget which one for sure, but he brought together black and white Jacksonville residents to mourn and express their grief over the shooting of Martin Luther King. And one of the results of that was there was no rioting in Jacksonville after the assassination. So Tansler, as mayor, took the lead in that, bringing people together.
That is leadership.
I was going to say that the Episcopal Church, the cathedral in particular, was very proactive in some of this at the time. Those 3 towers that are downtown were a very deliberate, at the time, quite expensive attempt to re-inject housing back downtown at a time that it was all leaving. There's a nursing home downtown that was started at the same time by the cathedral, and of course Episcopal High School was started at the same time to get some high quality education in the town. So the
cathedral today is working in the community to enhance it.
Yeah, so we've certainly not been shy about being engaged.
I think that when you talk about showcasing the history of these buildings and the churches, I think it would be good to showcase this rich history that Dr. Crox was just talking about, and showcase what's going on right now, what the Cathedral District is doing now, what the other churches are doing now during this pandemic, how we are still reaching people and still serving people, because all of the churches, though doors have been closed at some point in time, they're still reaching out. They're still serving. I know First Methodist has been providing help with the homeless. We have been doing meals. We've been doing after school things. Everybody has been still serving God, still being the church, even in this kind of uncertain times that we're in right now. I think all of that needs to be showcased if we ever want a younger generation to look, see, and come and see. People come and see when they know something is going on, and that is a way to keep the churches in the light, and so that they can continue to grow and people can embrace the rich history and legacy of these churches and continue them, because that's what it is to be the church. Just be the church.
And sometimes we don't give each other credit for what we actually do. The 12-step meetings that occur in our basements are every bit as much church as anything that we do on a Sunday. So
absolutely.
Yes. I'd like to add that Good Shepherd has always sponsored AA meetings, and we have the first Boy Scout troop in Jacksonville, and it's still going, Troop 007, which is kind of fun. And we had Girl Scouts, and just a lot of community outreach. Also, we work with every week, bring food for St. Catherine's Food Pantry, and we have one day a week devoted to just handing out food in the neighborhood. During pandemic, we have of course Zoom services like most other churches, but we also had some members just volunteer to donate money, just to give thousands of dollars to people that if anyone knew, church members who had lost their jobs and were having a very hard time. And I thought that was just wonderful. I mean, we didn't pass the plate. We didn't ask for it. People were just thinking of their fellow church member and people in the neighborhood. We are in an urban neighborhood, so we do the same thing. We try so hard to incorporate everybody around the Riverside, Avondale area.
Jenny,
One thing,
the people of First Methodist did the same. They were just so loving and so giving,
yeah,
trying to reach others, and then we often use our building for family promise for families who are in distress. And so we've had a wonderful time of just reaching out and giving and sharing the love of Christ with our community.
yes. I want to take the opportunity to ask everybody to check out the chat room because there have been some pretty good comments. We've got another one about another older church in the Springfield area, St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church. It's the oldest Lutheran church in Jacksonville, second oldest in Florida. So if you want to check out those comments, I think they're worthwhile. Somebody else had asked if there are any self-guided tours for the Carpenter Gothic churches that are up and down the St. John's River. Does anybody know the answer to that?
I'm pleased to share with you a couple of things on that. We have, for those of you who don't know, when Bishop John Freeman Young came here from New York, we have a long history of involvement back and forth with Trinity Wall Street, including our current bishop. And we've sent some people there. Dean Parks went from here up there, and Jim Cooper did the same from Ponte Vedra. And so as part of that beginning of that legacy, John Freeman Young came down here and became the second bishop right after the Civil War with no money and virtually nothing, had to start from scratch. And he stayed until his death. His second wife was a Stockton, so there was a beginning of some Wall Street relationships in the commercial side. And he commissioned the same architect that did Trinity Wall Street, which is one of the great churches in the world, frankly, to do some plans that could be done down here in this environment on what they called Carpenter Gothic. It was part of a sort of a revival of Gothic traditions in the Anglican Church and worldwide and in America as well. So we have a string of these, and they go up and down the St. John's River. They predate even the railroad. And so we've got a lot of them, and we've got them in some places that had a lot of promise, but perhaps stayed a little sleepier than some of the founders had in mind, like Federal Point and Welaka and some places up and down the river. And they're just absolutely gorgeous and charming. And as God would have it, two gentlemen came into my office 2 years ago and said, we are serious historians. One is a Holland and Knight retired attorney, very serious scholar. And the other is also a descendant of the Williamses, Phil Eschenbach, and he's an old cracker family. And they, like 7 or 8 generations in the New Smyrna area. And he was a world-class commercial photographer. And they had conspired together for a number of years and gone to all of them and taken serious photography and have also produced a very serious history. And we're looking at doing we're in the throes of producing what we anticipate will be a desktop book, a coffee table book that'll be used as a fundraiser for maintenance of these churches going forward and to preserve the history in a very meaningful way, because they are subject to fire and things like that. So, and we're hoping to roll all of that into a tour using our Bishop's Institute, headed by Dr. Dupree, who was a scholar at Oxford for many decades and came from Orange Park and is now returned to one of our Gothic churches. And so we're anticipating having some tours that might even include a boat. As far as self-guided, if anybody wants to take a tour of any of the churches that are in the Episcopal domain, just call us and we'll arrange a guided tour, not a self-guided tour, we promise.
That's a distinctive architectural history of the region and a good way to tell the story of the region's growth and expansion, isn't it? And am I correct, Allison, that Robert Schuyler was the principal architect for a number of the Carpenter Gothics?
For a number for a number of them, and they're so well designed for the, this is where it gets interesting for an old cracker like me, is that they were so designed in tune with the architecture. I mean, the architecture was in tune with the environment, that one of our absolutely favorite ones is in Green Cove Springs, St. Mary's, and it's high, it's elevated 10 or 12 feet above, it's right by the river. It's probably one of the most scenic churches in all of this region. And it has these flow-through windows that you don't have to open up the windows. You can open up down where your feet are, and it allows the air to circulate in. So after one of the early hurricanes, I went down there and I said, well, what kind of damage was there? And they said virtually none, because it was high and the flooding didn't much get in, and what little it is, they could open it up and drain it out. They said, well, all we really lost was the air conditioning. And I said, well, where was the air conditioning? And they said, well, we put it underneath the church. And I went, oh, vey. So it did not occur to me too late that was where they were going to put it with the insurance proceeds when they put it back. And sure enough, it's back there underneath waiting for the next flood. So the early architects were much more in tune with the environment that we're in than sometimes we are today. I'll put it that way.
It's one of the struggles of old churches that were designed and built before the days of air conditioning as to how we retrofit those buildings. Members of the Historical Society know this already, but the Jacksonville Historical Society is the steward of Old St. Andrew's Church, built in 1888 on the east side of Jacksonville. At the time, it was a vibrant residential community, and its congregation lived in houses throughout that neighborhood. Now the church stands immediately next door to the baseball grounds and across from the front entrance of the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena and just south of the fairgrounds. So not serving a residential community, deconsecrated by the diocese, but still really a great example of the architect we just mentioned, Robert Schuyler, and a great management challenge to us. It's air conditioned now, but it was never built to be air conditioned. The air conditioning is in the basement underneath the church. As is the case with so many grand old sanctuaries, they have great high walls and high ceilings and lots of hard reflective surfaces. And they are great acoustically for organ and piano music, but for the spoken word, not so much. And so we face the challenge of amplified electronic audio systems that, in my experience, are the product of the devil's workshop and should be abhorred in the 21st century.
And we look forward to going back to church when Lot J someday.
Mm-hmm.
Stained glass windows are characteristic of our old churches, and they are a perpetual challenge, but they mean so much to the history of the congregation. In the case of my church, Riverside Presbyterian, the windows were commissioned back during World War II in the early 1940s, and each window underwritten by a family or a group of families, and in many cases underwritten to honor their beloveds. And now, 80 some odd years later, these windows desperately need protection, preservation, and maintenance. Pastor Clear, I think you know something about this in the context of Mount Olive, am I right?
You got an estimate of $50,000 just to revitalize the larger panes of stained glass. That's just one. That's just one. $50,000. And as you already mentioned, it makes insurance near impossible. You have to negotiate to the nth degree. Mount Olive also has and I don't think it's been lifted up enough, Dr. Bliss, the association between R.L. Brown and A.L. Lewis. One of the things that caught my eye during the PowerPoint is that almost every other sanctuary had a listing of a contractor. You notice that Mount Olive only had the listing of R.L. Brown as the architect. That's because he and A.L. Lewis combined to contract the job themselves.
Mm-hmm.
think that history goes to some of the work that Mr. Lewis did in the northern area near Fernandina. And we're going to do more to lift up that history. I don't think it's been lifted up enough with Edward Waters College, nor with R.L. Brown Elementary. I think we should do at least a week or more on the history and the importance of R.L. Brown and A.L. Lewis and what they did to make that church in 1922 come to fruition.
You are so right about that. And for those on the call who don't know, Pastor Clear is referring to A.L. Lewis, one of the co-founders of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, one of the pioneering insurance companies, and reportedly the first life insurance company in Jacksonville, a significant employer, a significant resource for Jacksonville's Black community. And Mr. Lewis, of course, also the creator of the American Beach community up on Amelia Island.
Right.
And really a giant of business and a giant of civic life in this community. And I did not know that about the connection with Mount Olive. So thanks for highlighting that.
And we'll research that. But yes, Mr. Lewis was a staunch member of Mount Olive. And R.L. Brown, I found out, was a presiding elder in the AME Church, as well as an architect and builder.
R.L. Brown also designed the library, the Centennial Library at Edward Waters College.
That is correct.
He needs to be recognized for his contributions to Jacksonville's architectural history.
I agree so much, and that's when I'm trying to get a grant right now to lift up that connection, and even pointed out to the fact that he was recognized by the early days of the NAACP when they were giving out the Spring Yarn Awards. I think that's what it was. R.L. Brown was recognized with a Spring Yarn, maybe not a medal, but he was mentioned as they gave out their yearly awards back in the early 1900s. He was listed as being the first African-American architect in the South. And I don't think we give that up enough, his importance to the world of architecture.
Kate, have we heard from anyone else on the chat that has questions or comments that we ought to be sharing?
Was somebody else going to speak? Oh, no.
I would just like to say, if no one else is waiting, that
it's 8 o'clock.
Unless a student goes into liturgical studies these days, we are not instilling and teaching the passion of maintaining our churches and going forward with what we already have. And I think it's very important that we, those of us who care about the church buildings themselves and our congregations, that we try to encourage our youth to have a passion for the arts, because that's sort of the way to learn. That's the thread. And all of us are probably baby boomers or near, and we have a big gap coming behind us who don't have these same interests right now. And that's what I worry about, that this history is going to get lost. These buildings are going to crumble if we don't have another group of passionate students and lovers of history coming behind us.
We have a comment.
Passion needs to be by the priests, because the buildings are tools to teach with. And the best service I've ever attended my entire life was in Notre Dame in Paris. It was a chanted Gregorian mass at 7 o'clock in the morning in Latin. And my Latin was not up to the task, but it was a Catholic service, so I did sort of know where we were. But the point I hope I'm making, is that by the time the lights and the stained glass and the morning sun and the smells and the bells and the chanting and everything clicked together, it occurred to me for the first time what a cathedral really does. It's a machine. It's a God machine, if you will. It's an attempt to, when you put it all together, it touches all of the parts of the brain that our rational mind doesn't get to most of the time. And it's an attempt by a higher power to use these tools to get to a part of us that we don't normally speak to, where we can be more receptive to God in that way.
Before we close, I'd like to recognize Christopher Martin, who has had his hand up for a little bit.
I served as the rector of St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs for 24 years. And during that time, we celebrated our 125th anniversary. And my wife went down to the archives, my wife Sandy, and did a lot of research, which we've provided and sent to the congregation. But that church was designed by Charles Haight, who was the architect of the, for many wealthy Episcopalians in the New York area, but he also designed the chapel at General Seminary. And if you go into St. Mary's and look at it, it's got what's called a rood screen. Rood's an old English word for cross. And outside of the altar, there's it's very simple, but some wooden framework that has a cross on it. And that is not in many Episcopal churches anymore. It kind of represents the iconostasis, the icon screen that's in Orthodox churches. And, you know, I agree. When I was a freshman in college and I was in a preparatory school, a church school, we had a minister come and talk to us about the arts in the church. And he was responsible for building a really wonderful Lutheran church in Chicago that beautifully contemporary, but yet used the local arts. And he said, you know, if you need a cross, don't get a catalog, which we do in the Episcopal Church. We use the Almy catalog and get this beautiful brass. He says, find a local artist to design it for you. And when I had a Lutheran mission before I came into the Episcopal Church, that's precisely what we did. We hired local artists we had a David Ingdahl sculpture for a cross in that church, and Bob Brower designed it. And it was, you know, I agree with who, I forgot who said that. Was that you, Jenny, that's talked
Yes.
about the clergy?
Yes, the arts.
I'm not sure that seminarians today are as well prepared as I fortunately was.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Dr. Bliss, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, I would just, I would say that there were a couple of people who posted in the chat with reference to a church in Arlington designed by Bob Broward. And
Right.
we have a resource here at the Jacksonville Historical Society about Bob Broward's work. And the late Mr. Broward's daughter, Catherine Broward Barnes, Christina Broward Barnes, is a member of our board of directors now. Anyway, Kate, I think we've got the ability to save the content of the chat, do we not? So that we can try to respond offline to people if it's possible for us to be helpful and responsive to them. If not, I think I can at least copy the text and save it. And something we have alluded to indirectly is music. Allison was talking about the tremendous influence and energy of the Gregorian chant in the setting of the cathedral. We didn't really get to the voice of the church in the form of the great pipe organ, but it's all part of what adds to the immensity and the power and the sense of connection with the creator, however we imagine the creator being, or whoever we imagine the creator being. Church music has inspired so many people, both in and outside the church. And many know that the Jacksonville Historical Society is launching a music history museum devoted to principally Jacksonville's music history, but with no really sharp boundaries around it. And the music of the church, gospel, and other religious music is a part of that story. And so we're mindful of that and thinking about the future of that project. We've reached the time and exceeded it that we budgeted for this evening. And if we were meeting in person face to face, we would probably hang around for another half hour or 45 minutes and chat with each other And I so much look forward to the day when we can resume that happy practice. I have missed all of you and seeing all of you in person, and I look forward to doing that again, I hope in this brave new year of 2021. In the meantime,
Amen.
stay tuned for our ongoing speaker series. Next month's program will, as always, be in commemoration of Black History Month, and it will be focused on the Masonic Temple in downtown Jacksonville, a building with its own unique heritage and story and generations of stewardship and care. And we have more programs ahead, news to follow, and announcements about that coming up. We welcome your engagement with Jacksonville history and the work that the Historical Society does. I want to thank our panelists for participating in this evening. We have so many great stories in this city, and that's our job at the Jacksonville Historical Society, to preserve them and share them. Many thanks to all of you. Please stay safe and healthy, and good night for now.
Good night.
Thank you.